Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco van Zyl and Christine Seefen. So as part of our promotion of the recently released book, Cynical Therapies, Perspectives on the Anti-Therapeutic Nature of Critical Social Justice, we are pleased to have as our guest today, Bret Alderman from California. Bret is a life coach and a writer from Oakland, California. He studied depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where he obtained his PhD. He also has a book that was recently released, Symptom, Symbol, and the Other of Language, a Jungian interpretation of the Linguistic Turn. And Bret was one of the co-authors of the book, Cynical Therapies. And he authored the chapter with the title, and I love this title, The Intoxicating Ideas of Critical Social Justice. God-shaped ideologies for God-shaped wholes. How catchy is that?
Amazing.
Welcome, Bret. We're really delighted to have you as our guest.
Yes.
Thank you for having me, and I'm glad you love the title so much.
We're so happy to have you. So our first question is just to kind of share a bit about, the chapter. What motivated you to write about the particular, topic that you chose?
Yeah, I'd say my motivation for this particular chapter and its focus was twofold. One was that I noticed that a lot of people from really different political and ideological backgrounds were pointing to a sense in which a lot of critical social justice seems to have sort of a quasi-religious ethos. A lot of people are talking about it as a cult or as a new religion or as a secular religion. And a lot of times this is from people who occupy really, really different ideological positions. I mean, everything from someone like John McWhorter, who's kind of a center-left secular thinker and a linguist, who I really appreciate. But then there's also what other people would consider far right, or at least right of center religious people like Matt Walsh, who's a podcaster. And when people of that different of a background are seeing the same thing, it kind of gets you thinking, right? I mean, this is a lot of people pointing to this. And then I guess the second motivation is that as somebody who really loves Jung, I know that Jung wrote and thought a lot about this. And so I really wanted to bring his thinking to the fore, because I think he has a lot to offer in that regard.
When you talk about the kind of this religion component, cult kind of component that we started to associate this ideology with, say a little bit more about that, because I think that was very interesting for me, and I had heard it being referenced as a religious movement actually in some way. And so when I read your chapter, I appreciated how you discussed it, because it's the first time I had ever read so much about it, or to thought about it in that deeply, let's say. Right. So can you share a little bit about that connection and how that happened, developed? Or
so I mean, Jung's basic thesis, and it's, I'm boiling it down and kind of reducing it, but was that, when a lot of people sort of lost religion, with the coming of the Enlightenment, and for a lot of people, religion just no longer spoke to them in the same way, and they weren't meaningful stories anymore. And his basic idea was that even though God seemed to have disappeared, he would say that gods and demons and spirits sort of just reappeared in different clothing. So one of the ways he described this was that gods became isms. So, think Marxism, Nazism, capitalism, materialism, any sort of ideology. Religion kind of took on new clothing and became ideology. That's kind of the really basic premise. Now, I could go into like some of the qualities that I think make an ideology really into an ideology or a quasi-religion. And I think one of them is that, let's say, ideas become divinized or deified. So a lot of times there arises like a single central explanatory principle, a single central idea, and it's used to explain virtually everything. And this is really similar to a religious thought that, God is Alpha and Omega. Everything arises from him and returns to him. Now, I think within a religious context and understood as a religious belief, this can be an important idea. I'm not really trying to criticize that idea as much as point out that when we're thinking in that religious framework and not aware that we're doing so, that's when things get really kind of tricky and potentially kind of scary. And that's when I think it becomes useful to talk about ideological possession. I can give an example of this that I think is really, I think explains the point really well for me. Not long ago, well, it might have been a year ago or so, I was watching a clip of Ibram X. Kendi, and somebody asked him, could you define racism for me?
Yeah.
And he said something to the effect that, racism is any set of practices that lead to racist results or
Racist policies.
or racist policies,
Right.
something along those lines. And I think the important thing to note is that it was a circular definition. He was in effect using the word to define itself, or using a cognate of the word in order to define the word. Now, on one level, that's simply, it's poor thinking. It's not intellectually coherent. It's sort of circular thinking. That's one level of criticism, and I think it's a really valid one. On another level, I think what's going on is we could describe it as racism has become his god. It's the alpha and omega. Everything is explained through racism. That's where it starts. That's where it ends. That's the circularity that happens when you've kind of divinized an idea, and that single idea is used kind of in this reductive way to kind of explain everything. I think another important thing to think about is, does the single idea that appears to be divinized or deified, does it have any sort of counterbalance? Like, okay, well, what are the other possible ways we could think about, the opposite of racism, or what else is in play? Or, maybe I think inclusion might be a good example of, how we could think about this. Well, a lot of people are talking about inclusion, which is, I think, an important value. However, if it is the primary value, the only value, and we can't see that there are countervailing principles that also are important that we need to consider, then that's another indication that there's some ideological possession, because we can all recognize, and there are instances where exclusion is an important value. I'm
Can
sure
you say more about that? Just
a really good example of this that maybe a lot of people can relate to is, the question of inclusion in female-only spaces. Now, there's a lot of push from certain people to include trans women, meaning biological men who are identifying as the opposite sex or gender, and there's a push to include them, and it's considered a primary value that we be inclusive in that situation. Well, there's also a countervailing push that from a lot of people who some describe themselves as radical feminists, some don't, some are just women who are saying, well, wait a second, no, I would like to exclude those people. I would like to exclude men from female spaces. And you know, that kind of brings me to another aspect of of this whole question of possession is when those ideas get emotionally charged.
Yes.
Now, if it's a situation where a person can say, you know, I don't feel comfortable. I don't believe in that. I don't really want biological men included in those spaces. And then if what ensues is a fairly calm discussion where people give their pros and cons and everybody has a chance to speak, well, then, I mean, that's a good indication that people maybe aren't kind of possessed in this way that I'm talking about. But a lot of times what happens is if you touch upon the kind of the sacred principle, in this case, you know, inclusion, there's such a incredible emotional charge there that what happens is the person who's having that value questioned or relativized in some way has, you know, an emotional reaction that might range from, you know, irritation and annoyance to abject rage, which, you know, anyone who has some familiarity with psychology, a lot of people who don't, can recognize that that's indication of, you know, a psychological complex, you know, a trauma. There's that sort of affective charge indicates something in psychological terms.
This is something Jaco and I were just talking about, is the driving force being the emotional rather than the cognitive or the intellectual that makes it so much more dangerous. I'll just use that word. And powerful.
What I also found from your chapter, building upon this concept of a new type of religion having been developed, in addition to this totalizing worldview that it is, this tribalism, and it's an emotionally charged tribalism, that as soon as you start questioning, as soon as you start disagreeing, there is this extreme disproportionate response from the other side, by which you are completely demonized as the enemy. So this hard split, and that's where I agree with you, where the substrate, the foundational psychological drive underneath this ideology is a type of a defensive split. And then also these other features that you mentioned, this feature of confession, where people confess their guilt, their contribution to oppression. And of course, now also in line with this psychological or this emotional acting out would be these heresy hunting that would sometimes take place, where person would be identified as someone who's not thinking along the same lines, and they need to be cancelled, or they need to be humiliated publicly or embarrassed publicly.
Yeah, I mean, it really does remind me of things like pogroms. It reminds me of things like, well, just extreme splitting that often takes place in, you know, we've seen it a lot in Christianity where, you know, you know, Protestantism seems to get split into smaller and smaller and smaller sects. And each sect or each belief system believes itself to be the way. And so if you have even the slightest sort of theological difference of opinion, then yeah, I think you're considered a heretic. I mean, heresy is the right word to bring up in this case. There's that. There's I think there's also, of course, when you touch upon that emotionally charged idea, of course, there's bound to be projection. There's bound to be an in-group and an out-group.
Mm-hmm.
There's bound to be some, splitting in the
Mm.
sense of all of a sudden the world is sort of reduced to the really good people
Yes.
and the really bad people.
The
Mm.
saved
So,
versus the unredeemed, right?
right,
So in
right.
a sense,
Mm.
I think I loved that
Yeah.
idea from your book, how you described the idea of the saved, which would maybe be the in group, and the unredeemed, the out group, who are going
Right.
to be in some way punished.
Yeah. And in terms of, confession, this brings us to the idea of, things like original sin,
Mm.
also the need, the need, it's a real interesting thing, confession, because I think people do have a sort of inborn need to acknowledge wrongs that they've committed.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
But in a social sphere where it's linked up to potentially being ostracized, it
Mm.
can take on a really nefarious aspect. Um, and I think we're seeing a lot of that. It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast just last night. I was watching a Glenn Greenwald talk with Katie Herzog. And they're both people who have traditionally identified on the left and a part of the
Right.
LGBTQ
Right.
community. And they were talking about relatively small differences of opinion that they had that they felt just completely resulted in them being completely ostracized from that
Mm.
community,
Yes.
which was ironic. And I think it's something that a lot of us have felt. I know in the past I have felt that I'm, generally speaking, kind of on the left. And yet I've definitely felt within the last few years that if I, differ on, certain questions about identity or certain emphasis or, just don't kind of toe the party line, then, there's this kind of immediate, to get this sense that I get immediately placed within the other group,
Mm-hmm.
the heretical group. Um,
What moment did you find all of this CSJ ideology to be problematic? Not just something that's there and it sits in the background or it's fleeting, but actually problematic in its insidiousness and how injected it's become. At what point did you start to see that?
Yeah, for me in my own trajectory, there's been, I think, kind of two moments. The more recent one, when things really started to feel um kind of scary, um, where I really started to think in terms of possession, which is kind of a loaded term that I sometimes don't even like using, but it's starting to feel like the right term more and more. And that probably happened sometime around lockdown, which I think
Mm.
just had an incredible emotional toll on people that we will be recovering from for quite a while. And it's going to take us a long time to even really fully acknowledge the deep wounding that was for a lot of us, for probably all of us in some way. That was the big moment. But there's kind of been I've been working on ideas that I think I would associate with postmodernism that I were kind of birthed in they became really prominent in the 90s. And so, I was sort of tracking certain ideas that I saw come to full bloom a lot of ways, kind of in the last couple of years.
I agree with you on the lockdown and
Mm.
COVID and the collective
Mm.
trauma inflicted upon us. And I wonder if that didn't
Mm.
only worsen this radicalization trend that we see in the
Yeah,
world.
yeah,
You speak of the intoxicating allure,
Mm.
the intoxicating ideas of critical social justice, and you go into social constructivism.
right,
And I
right.
wonder, from a Jungian perspective and your understanding of it, What makes it so alluring?
Give a definition just briefly of what that means, social constructivism, because we want to make sure this is also accessible to people that don't have a background in some of this, psychology, sociology, all of it.
Yeah, I mean, let's say there are nuanced forms of this, and there are less nuanced forms, and in giving a really thumbnail description, I'll focus on the less nuanced forms. It's kind of this idea that facts and theories and hypotheses and narratives and any sort of scientific knowledge, it really says little about the object of study and a great deal about the social position and the interests and the biases of those who practice it. Sort of this idea that all of the ideas that we thought might have been grounded in something objective or real or true are sort of really just kind of social agreements, kind of stories that we've come up with. And they're stories that we've come up with to a large degree because of the particular place we occupy in a particular culture. Now, a really extreme version of this, I think, might be someone like, when Judith Butler will say things like, the sex binary. She will say that that's socially constructed. And so there's a sense in which it's not grounded in the sort of the given fact of differences in biology that are transcultural and transhistorical, something that's there regardless of how we might language it, or regardless of what particular culture we're in, or regardless of what particular discipline we've been trained in. It's just sort of it's a fact, it's a given, it's a prediscursive given. And she would take issue with that. She would say, well, no, you can't do that. It's actually, she would say, it's so embedded in things like language. It's so embedded in discourse. It's so embedded in, particular disciplinary norms, she would say, that it's not a given. It's not something that you can just say just simply is. And so, I think what a certain form of social constructionism does is it says what you thought were facts aren't facts. And there are no facts as we had previously understood. Facts are actually sort of self-interested fictions or myths. And this is where I think someone like Jung is really, really good, because when they're saying, well, certain facts are actually just myths, Jung comes in and he says, well, when you think that way, then myths become factual. So that you take sort of mythic narratives and you believe those to be the absolute truths. And so then ideas that you think of as being sort of, let's say, really secular ideas that are just based on, particular discipline like sociology, you can start to see sort of these quasi mythical or religious structures in them, right?
Right.
I mean, one example of this might be whiteness. Now, whiteness has taken on this sort of almost like this quasi spiritual quality to it, where it's, on the one hand, it seems to refer to or be associated with the color of skin of certain people and European culture, because most Europeans, historically have been of fair skin. But then it also takes on this sort of quality where it's also transferable, so that you can say that, well, certain people of color actually are suffering from whiteness. And then, they're suffering from it because it has sort of this negative connotation. And so it kind of takes on this quality of almost being this like demonic sort of spirit that can possess other people.
Right.
And it's hard, you can't exactly point at it, but it can be referenced at any given moment. So it's
Mm.
kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time, which is yet another quality that we often associate with deities. You know, they're
Right.
both
Demons.
everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And they can't be pointed at exactly.
So it's this concept creep that
Yeah.
they subject themselves to, or that they're actively pushing. They would use one word, but when you look into the definition of that word, you start realizing, but this word isn't really what it's meaning to be.
Yeah.
For instance, anti-racism.
Mm-hmm.
When you think anti-racism, to be against racism, that's not what anti-racism means. Anti-racism means that as someone who has bought into this whole binary of oppressor and oppressed, anti-racism would be to protest against this by turning against these identified collectives, and fight against these identified collectives, even if it means that you have to be discriminatory toward these individuals as tokens of the collective. And that would make you an anti-racist. But that by definition makes you a racist all over again. You've just replaced the characters, the role players.
Yeah.
The same with whiteness. The language is essentializing. And I think they did that deliberately, because they know that at some level, this word registers in essentializing ways within our minds. That even though strictly speaking, some might say, but whiteness just refers to white supremacy and the different ways in which it plays out. They could have used the expression white supremacy, or they could have just used the expression racial supremacy or superiority. But that would not achieve the objective, namely to morally condemn a certain group of people based on essential characteristics, namely they being white. And that is what they actually try to achieve. A building up of a certain sentiment of negativity toward people who serve as tokens of the larger collective, and by using essentializing language, such as whiteness. What do you think about that?
There's 2 or 3 things I want to say in response to that. One is that, you know, for example, with whiteness and concept creep, you know, I think of the word systemic, you know, systemic racism. And when the concept creeps in the way that it has been, from my perspective, the essential validity of the original idea gets really lost. So, you know, someone like me, I can buy in to the idea of systemic racism if you want to talk about redlining. You know, if you point to, for example, the strange way in which maybe speed limits are enforced, where they get enforced more against one racial category than another. Now, if we're talking about systemic racism in those sort of concrete terms, I'm down with that. I'm open to it. That seems like a valid way that we can think about this idea of systemic racism. But what happens is we get this incredible concept creep where all forms of inequity are sort of, you know, attributed to this really vague thing of systemic racism. And the beauty of the systemic modifier is that it's everywhere and nowhere. I mean, where is the system?
It's intangible. It's very intangible. It's a very broad brush umbrella, which has been so hard for me to really swallow, quite frankly, because I don't have a tangible way to understand this or to be able to prove or disprove that it exists. And which system are we talking about? Because we have we're multi-systemic, systems within systems within systems.
Right.
So when these bigger things come out in that way, I can't get a handle on it, which means I cannot say that I believe that that is actually something that is happening all the time, everywhere, all at once.
Right. I want to quickly like segue back to something that Yaku was touching upon. You know, it's I think a lot of us are seeing, for example, how, you know, anti-racism seems to replicate the very evil that it claims to be combating. You know, for someone who has any background in you know, psychoanalysis or psychology of the unconscious, or probably many other forms of psychology, this isn't entirely surprising. This is something that we see a lot.
Right.
We know that people will often replicate the very thing that they are combating in others. That's
Yeah.
part of the whole projective nature of complexes. That's part of the whole nature of things like projective identification.
Right.
It's part of
Specifically.
dissociation. We know this. And so I think that's one of the reasons why for me and for others, I think it's particularly disturbing to see these types of ideas sort of invading the psychotherapeutic space, because we know better and we actually have the ideas to diagnose some of the ills of those social movements. We have a whole tradition of ways of understanding this that could actually shed light on what's going on in these social movements and make them more self-aware. And I think at the moment the movement is quite the opposite, where, you know, people are putting on, you know, workshops to unearth the Eurocentrism of, you know, every single form of Western psychology, and are in the very process also throwing out a lot of the genius of those traditions that could actually
Absolutely.
help them shed light on those movements. I don't,
Right.
yeah. So,
That contradiction.
yeah.
Isn't it interesting how they, you know, someone who's a strong social constructivist would say everything is socially constructed.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as fact. And this, what I just said, that is a fact.
Right. And this brings me to something I really do want to mention. I'm surprised I haven't mentioned it yet, but you know, Jung talked a lot about what he called the nothing but attitude.
Yes.
And another way he described that was reductionism. He also described it as the insistent leitmotif of one-sidedness. And so, you know, that's what I see a lot of when you adopt something like social constructionism.
Yes.
If you're saying it's nothing but that, that's, I mean, that's kind of the crucial, that's when you sort of fall over the cliff. Now, can I acknowledge that there's an element of social construction in a lot of things? Well, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
That's where the nuance comes in.
That's where the nuance comes
Yes.
in.
Right.
Nuance.
That's the weak form of the Worf Sater
Yeah.
hypothesis of
Yeah.
language. That's the
Right.
weak form, and we acknowledge that as something that exists.
Right. And you know, in like earlier postmodernism, it might be like the distinction between, you know, creation and discovery. I mean, does language create certain realities, or is it more like a reflection of pre-existent realities, right? And there are, well, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole, but there are plenty of thinkers out there who are able to kind of see both elements and acknowledge social constructionism, and also acknowledge that, you know, as human beings, we simply perceive primary distinctions. It's part of our perception, and that language later reflects that. So it's not all just sort of arbitrarily constructed or constructed by virtue of the particular culture we're in or particular power dynamics that are at work, which is a particular reductive move that I see a lot of lately.
So one of the subheadings is from social constructivism or constructionism to social contagion.
Yeah.
How about you elaborate a bit on that? I have a position on that as well.
Yeah. I think because social constructionism, at least in its really reductive form, sort of dissociates ideas from any sort of grounding in, let's say, objective reality or even perceived reality. It's really, really conducive to sort of contagious ideas
Yes.
because it doesn't have that sort of counterbalancing principles. You
Mhm.
know, if you say that you know, biological sex is just a social construction, and you don't allow for people to like kind of reference kind of objective reality, then that idea can just run on its own. And there's something sort of enticing about it because that means you're kind of not subject to sort of objective reality, objective truths. I mean, you can kind of tell whatever story is emotionally appealing to you, or whatever story actually helps you avoid difficult confrontation, maybe with some of your own emotional issues, right?
Right.
It's just, it's not, because it's not grounded, it, it, yeah, it can be just incredibly contagious. There's no way of, another way is saying it is there's no way to prove or disprove it.
Mhm.
If I tell you, if there's a certain way of thinking about gender that allows me to say, well, you know, I'm non-binary, or you know, I can create any gender I want. And there's a certain way of thinking about it that makes it impossible for anyone else to say, well, no, you're
How's
not.
that possible?
I can see that you're not, you know. But as soon as, for example, you dissociate the idea of sex from gender in sort of this absolute way, then it has no grounding principle in it,
Right.
and in
Mhm.
principle it can multiply thousands
Yeah.
of
Mm.
genders, and there's no way of saying, well, no, there,
Yes.
Right.
it just can't go that far, you know.
And it starts moving into some categories where it's difficult to distinguish whether the person's referring to gender or species.
Right, right. I
So
was
what
actually trying,
distinguishes classification as a
yeah,
gender versus a
yeah.
classification as a species? Right.
I was trying to come up with a one of those species
Examples.
genders, and I just couldn't quite come up with one. So said
It's,
non-binary, but they're out there, you know.
yes.
And this unmooring from reality, that is problematic.
Right. And in Jungian terms, it's like you're completely opening the door of the collective unconscious. And
Mm.
so that all these kind of like
Mhm.
mythological creatures kind of pop out, but
Right.
they actually possess the conscious
Mm.
mind and the conscious ego, because the conscious mind and the conscious ego isn't grounded in time and space reality. And so it can kind of be anything that it wants. And that's when you get people identifying with sort of archetypal um, images, you know,
Yeah.
saying that, well, I'm actually a wolf. I'm actually, you know, uh,
Vampire.
yeah, I'm a vampire. And this brings me, I want to just really quickly touch upon something that feels relevant to that. The idea of the literalizing of a metaphor.
Mm.
Now, the
Mm.
idea that I'm a vampire, if I take that as a metaphor, it could be a really productive way of me reflecting upon myself. Is there something in the way I'm interacting with people that sort of sucks the lifeblood out of them? Oh God. Well, that could be the case. I
Mm.
think we've all known people who can kind of walk into a room and we kind of feel like
Yeah.
they suck the energy out of it. Now, as a metaphor, vampire is a wonderful metaphor. That can be a really rich thing to think about in terms of a psychological complex or a psychological state. As soon as you literalize it, you lose that richness,
Mm.
and you're possessed by that image, so to speak.
And if a psychologist buys into this, they lose their analytical frame.
Yeah,
They lose their analytical position.
right.
They
Yeah,
start colluding with the patient.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah, absolutely.
What's the one or maybe two takeaways that you have or that you'd like somebody to have from what you wrote? To narrow it down, a couple of takeaways that you want people to get.
I think a big takeaway is that we are making ideas into gods. We're deifying or divinizing ideas. So ideas, you know, something like equity, inclusion, diversity, which might be, and I think in many ways are valuable and important ideas, but they're becoming sort of absolute ideas that are absolutely valued. And that means that they're becoming kind of like gods, because
Mm.
God is a symbol of the absolute. That would be a big part of it.
So what's the path forward that you see? How do we move in a different direction, or back to what the core values and principles of what our practice was about before it became so infiltrated? What does that look like in your view?
For me, it's really important to be able to continue to recognize that mythological ideas, they continue to be with us, and they're probably always going to be with us. And it's good to have a conscious relationship with them. There's always going to be an idea of death and rebirth that's going to manifest in us. It can manifest consciously, or it can manifest unconsciously. And in general, it's better to make conscious the unconscious.
Great.
Yeah.
This process, I know this is our last question, but I just want to ask something.
Yeah.
This process of deifying ideology, of recreating a new religion, God-shaped ideologies for God-sized holes, the way forward, are you anticipating an Icarus moment?
Yeah. I think it has to happen. It absolutely has to happen. I'm glad you brought up Icarus, because I mean, he is one of the central images in the book that I'm working on, that I believe will be out this year, which is called Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. And in Jungian terms, Icarus is an eternal youth figure. And, you know, he's unable to recognize sort of natural given limitations. He doesn't understand that you can fly too close to the sun. He thinks that his father, who's telling him not to fly so high, is just sort of being, you know, an antiquated fuddy-duddy who's unnecessarily restricting him. He doesn't understand that, no, there's sort of objective limits to what you can and cannot do. And I think a lot of thinking these days is sort of butting up against those objective limits, and we are going to see, I think, a dramatic fallout.
We've lost the guardrails in a lot of ways.
We've lost the guardrails. Absolutely.
Absolutely. That figure of the eternal youth, of which Icarus is a one exemplar, is characterized by not recognizing the limitations of time and space. That is what characterizes him as the eternal youth. So he just cannot acknowledge those as being fully existent.
And don't we need containment in order to be able to process our world and thrive? We need containment and guardrails that are eroding, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Limitation, a sense of our own mortality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It gives us the framework. It gives us the structure. Yeah. Okay.
This has been fun.
Bret, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure. Yeah.
Really enjoy your thinking, your contribution. Thank you very much. Look, as soon as that book is out, we would love to interview you.
One more time, tell us the title.
Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction.
Stunning.
And when is it out?
Well, I have to turn in the manuscript on April 1st. And so I'm hoping that, you know, within 9 months it will, you know, be out. So,
Excellent.
and it's going to be out in Routledge, And it's their series on
Yep.
philosophy and psychoanalysis, which is
Wow.
also the series that I wanted. So it's going to be
Incredible.
great, hopefully.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you. Thank you,
Thank
Bret.
you, Bret, so much.
Beautiful.
Happy to have you. All right.
Okay. Are we saying goodbye?
Yes, we are saying goodbye.
All right. It's been fun.
Oh, man.
Absolutely.